You're a farmer. 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the fertile hills of what will one day be called the Middle East. You don't have money. You don't have banks. You don't even have a word for economy. Your neighbor's roof just collapsed in a storm, and without thinking twice, you go help him rebuild it. No contract, no invoice, no fee, just a quiet understanding that hangs in the air between you. He owes you one. You don't write it down. You don't need to. Your memory is the only ledger that exists. And that, right there, is the first debt in human history. No coins, no interest rate, no collections agency. Just a favor and a feeling that it will get settled eventually, one way or another. You've probably always assumed money came first, and debt was invented later, once someone got clever with coins. That's the version they teach you in school. Barter first, money second, debt third. But you'd be wrong. Historians have gone looking for a society that actually ran on barter. 3 chickens for a goat, and they mostly can't find one anywhere. What you find instead, everywhere you look, is debt. You, as a species, figured out how to owe each other things a very long time, before you figured out how to pay each other in shiny metal. So, debt is ancient. But eventually you have to write it down. Fast forward a few thousand years. You're not a farmer anymore. You're a scribe now in the city of Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia. And your boss, a very stressed temple official, hands you a wet clay tablet and a stylus. Keep track of everything, he tells you. Grain, sheep, who owes who. So you press small wedge-shaped marks into the wet clay. This many bags of barley, owed by this farmer, due after this harvest. You've just invented writing, not poetry, not scripture, not the first great story ever told. And I owe you. The earliest written language on earth wasn't built to tell anyone a story. It was built so nobody could pretend they didn't owe you 3 goats. Now you're someone else entirely. You're a king. Specifically, you're Hammurabi of Babylon, around 1750 BC, and you have a serious problem on your hands. Debt has spiraled completely out of control across your kingdom. Farmers borrow grain to survive a bad harvest, and when they can't pay it back, they lose their land. Sometimes they lose their families. Sometimes they lose themselves, sold outright into slavery just to settle what they owe. You watch this happening across your entire kingdom, and you decide to do something about it. You write laws, you cap interest rates, you lay out exactly what happens when a bad harvest wipes a farmer out completely. And buried inside your code, you include something modern economists still argue about today, a debt jubilee. Every so often, by your own royal decree, you simply cancel outstanding debts across the kingdom. You reset the board. You let people start over. You've just figured out 4,000 years before anyone else has to relearn it that debt left completely unsupervised doesn't just help people through hard times. It can eventually eat the entire society you're trying to protect. Now you're in Athens, around 600 BC, and things have gotten far worse than they ever did under Hammurabi. Debt slavery has spread through your city like a disease. Farmers are being sold off. Their children are being sold off. Your entire city sits one bad harvest away from complete collapse. You're desperate, so you do something almost no city ever does voluntarily. You hand a lawmaker named Solon, terrifying, sweeping power over the whole city, and you tell him, fix this or we burn it down ourselves. His answer becomes legend. He cancels every existing debt in Athens in a single stroke, an event you'll come to know as the shaking off of burden. He outlaws debt slavery completely. Overnight, you watch thousands of your fellow citizens, people who sold themselves or their own children into bondage just to survive alone, walk free for the first time in years. Solon didn't invent debt. Nobody in this story invented debt. What he invented, standing right where you're standing, was the realization that debt needs a leash, or it will eventually strangle the very people who created it. But Athens isn't the only place you learn this lesson the hard way. Jump forward a few centuries, and now you're a Roman soldier, home from years of unpaid military service, fighting wars for a state that never once fed your family while you were gone. Your fields sat untended the entire time you were away. Your debts piled up regardless. And, under Roman law, if you default, you can legally become the literal property of whoever lent you the money. It's called Nexum, and you watch an entire generation of soldiers march home from victory parades straight into bondage. You won the war. You still lost the farm. Rome eventually bans the practice too, centuries later, after enough riots, after enough furious citizens threaten to simply walk out of the city and start their own. You start to notice a pattern. This isn't a one-time glitch in ancient Athens. It's a recurring feature of every early civilization that ever lets debt run completely unsupervised. Different empires, different clay tablets, same collapse over and over until somebody finally steps in. Now you're standing in England, the 1600s. You're the crown, and you need money for a war with the Dutch. Your usual trick, leaning on a handful of incredibly wealthy nobles, isn't working anymore. They've said no, so you try something completely new. Instead of begging one rich man for everything, you sell tiny pieces of your debt to the public. Anyone with a little spare cash can buy in. Hold a written promise, collect interest later. It's called a bond, and it changes everything about how you operate. You no longer need one obscenely wealthy lender. You need 1,000 moderately interested strangers, and it turns out there are always 1,000 moderately interested strangers. Debt stops being a personal favor between two people who know each other's names, the way it was between you and your neighbor with the broken roof. It becomes something impersonal, tradable, something total strangers on opposite ends of your country can hold a small piece of without ever meeting each other. By the 20th century, you're borrowing at a scale nobody standing in ancient Uruk could have possibly imagined. 2 world wars force you to borrow more than you ever have before. In 1944, you agree to tie your currency to the US dollar and the dollar to gold in an arrangement called Bretton Woods. Mostly so, everyone involved can keep pretending that money is still backed by something you can physically hold in your hand. It doesn't last. In 1971, the United States quietly ends the gold standard for good. Your money becomes what's called fiat currency, valuable purely because a government insists that it is, backed by nothing you could ever touch. And once you're no longer tied to a physical pile of gold sitting somewhere in a vault, the ceiling on how much you can borrow effectively disappears. You start building and you don't stop. You are here now in the present, standing on top of a debt pile worth more than $300 trillion, more than 3 times the value of everything the entire world produces in a single year combined. Stack that number in physical bills and you'd have enough to travel to the moon and back 50 separate times. That's not an exaggeration. That is the literal physical scale of the promise you've built, starting with one farmer, one collapsed roof, and one simple unwritten sentence. I owe you one. So ask yourself, who actually invented debt? Not a king, not a bank, not really an inventor at all in the way you usually think about inventions. It looks a lot more like something that was already inside you the moment you started living in groups too large to keep everything straight in your own memory. Writing, law, kings, empires, your entire modern financial system, all of it was built on top of debt, not the other way around. What Hammurabi and Solon actually gave you wasn't the idea of owing someone something. It was the first real attempt to stop that idea from eventually eating you alive. And 4,000 years later, you're still running that exact same experiment. You just added a lot more zeros. Somewhere right now, someone else is standing exactly where you started 10,000 years ago. A neighbor needs help, a roof needs fixing, and without any coins, any banks, any clay tablets, they make the same quiet promise you made at the very beginning of this video. I owe you one. That instinct never left. You just built an entire civilization on top of it.